Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we're going to be covering HEX, our moving average weekly percent change heat maps. Remember, if you like this kind of hybrid technical and quantitative analysis on the HEX charts, leave a thumbs up, be subscribed by the end of the video if you aren't already, and go ahead and check out LookIntoHex.com, which actually I believe is the only host of these moving average heat maps. I was a little zoomed in there, so it looked funny. So let's go ahead and talk about our moving average heat maps, okay? So let's zoom back in to show you exactly what I'm talking about. And we've covered this extensively on the channel. Check out the videos on heat maps if you haven't already. I'll leave a link to that here. But for the most part, it's pretty simple, right? There's a description here on LookIntoHex.com where the indicator, it's really a map of slope, right? You're color coding different slopes. And slope of what? Of moving averages. So for example, on the HEX chart, let's actually pull it up. Should have had this ready for you. If you look at V1 and you pull up your 100-day moving average, this is the curve. This orange curve is essentially the slope that we're looking at for our 100-day moving average heat map. So that's this first chart here on the heat map section of LookIntoHex.com. And you can see that around day 140, day 150 or so, when it started getting slightly overheated, that essentially corresponded to over here when this curve was becoming very, very steep. And then when it started leveling out and you saw the concavity shift right back to the, sort of leveling off, that's when the color started cooling down, if you can see that. It happened after the peak for the most part. After the peak, we see it start cooling down. And then here in this red region, which was the least risky, if you're using this as a risk metric, right? If you consider this red region around day 260 or so to be the least risky, we're talking about this over here. And why is that? It's because this moving average is actually sloping downwards, right? And so this moving average heat map takes into account slope relative to all other slopes. So the colors kind of shift over time, but this is essentially our least risky historical period of time to buy, even though it wasn't the lowest price. Funny enough, right? Less risky to buy over here than over here, because over here we already had a lot of momentum and we were moving up and things were due for a correction, as we saw. So another way to look at this, and the whole reason I'm actually making this video, is not to repeat what we've already talked about, right? But rather to look at this from a different angle. So instead of color coding it necessarily, there's also a way to look at these moving average heat maps, these slope heat maps, in a different light. So I'm going to pull it up right now. And with the chart I'm about to pull up, we're going to be getting our slope charts for our 100-day, our 200-day, and our 300-day moving average weekly percent change heat maps. I know that's a mouthful, but let's go ahead and take a look at it. They're these. On the right axis, we have price in US dollars. The white curve is the chart of price itself. Again, corresponds to this right vertical axis. However, instead of color coding our slope, we rather just plotted it. So for example, our 100-day moving average percent weekly change, right, is this pink curve. And you can see around day 145 or so, it's at around 0.46. And that essentially means that on day 145, the percent change of this curve, right, on day 145, the percent change of this curve was 46% in the last 7 days. So from day 130, day 138 to day 145, it jumped up 46%. And so that's a big jump, right? It's the peak jump. And that's why it corresponds to this peak here on this chart. And funny enough, it actually corresponds to, so day 145 in price was around here, slightly before the top. So this could have actually called the top, right? Pretty interesting. And this one over here, day 519, whereas the local top was around day, what is it, like 517? So this one actually kind of lagging. Interesting. So it was leading over here, lagging over here. So it's not a perfect indicator, right? There's no such thing as your perfect indicator. But yeah, it was lagging over here as well. 35. and it was lagging over here as well. Interesting. Yeah. So it might not necessarily be a leading indicator, right? There's no such thing as a perfect indicator that can perfectly predict what will happen, but I think this provides some insight, okay? We plotted our 100-day, 200-day, and our 300-day moving average percent weekly changes, and you can see that we are nowhere near as overheated on this chart as we have been in the past, right? The most recent local high, our curve was at its peak, moving up around 18.8% from day 513 to day 520, right? And that must have been literally just like a couple weeks ago. If we take a look at this curve, then we do look at that, right? If we take a percent change from, let's just say recently, to 257 is our 100-day moving average. And if we go back, let's say 7 days, we're at 225. So 257 over 225. What is that? Right? 14%. Whoops, put that in the wrong spot. 14%. So that shows us where we are in terms of our percent change. Okay? Now, what does this mean? It essentially tells me that there could be more room to move up. Why? Because this is nowhere nearly as overheated as it had been in the past. And so for this curve to start sloping up in the way this curve started sloping up, we'd have to be looking at changes of that slope in 7 days, 7-day changes of 24, 30, 35, 40%, and it started getting super overheated. What I find kind of interesting, and I know you can't do traditional technical analysis on this chart, but we're kind of finding the support, quote unquote, around these previous regions of resistance, which I find is kind of interesting. And then you have obviously your 200 and your 300-day, and if you notice something like our 200-day, well, it's peaking out in the pink recently. Why is that? Well, again, we didn't get data until after the first 200 days, and notice how it's the highest that it's been relative to the other 200-day, 7-day weekly changes. I know a lot of these terms are a mouthful, so let me know if there's any way I can alleviate that in the comments below. But I hope that makes sense. Like if you just look at this light blue curve, then you see that it did reach its highest point that it ever had been up to this point. But then again, we don't have much data. We only have literally a few hundred days. And keep in mind, this generally does best with very long-term moving averages. So again, I've said it many times on this channel that I think this will provide way better insight, way more insightful conclusions, I guess, once we start getting our 200-week, for example, moving averages, which we don't get until after about, 4 years of data. So there's a long way to go. Definitely relatively a new coin. We're already 1.5 years old as a coin, but I think there's still much more to come. So let me know what you guys think about this MA weekly percent change heat map on a different sort of perspective, because here you can obviously look at the colors and they're pretty and whatnot, but I think looking at it from a very quantitative version, like why is this pink? Well, because it corresponds to this peak over here. It gives you a better visualization of where we could be, right? Because on this 100-day moving average heat map, for example, we're still green. So we're still in this region over here. Potentially, we could still have further room to go. And that's illustrated here by, well, we could be looking at a 4x in slope. And this 4x in slope doesn't necessarily correspond to a 4x in price. It would essentially correspond to, the slope of this curve becoming pretty much like this, right? Here, let's show you real quick. Turn to the right line. So it would essentially correspond to the slope becoming something like that. And I wish I could actually translate this over here and move it. But for the most part, it would be, let's try to eyeball it, right? It would essentially be something like this. This isn't perfect, but it would essentially be this moving average starting to curve this way, which would actually only start happening if price started moving to the upside a lot, right? It'd be pulling the moving average with it. And so I do think there's plenty of room to move up. I've even started looking at the chart a bit differently, given how things are playing out, where if originally I thought we were in this fractal over here with only about a 2x move up, there have been charts that have kind of hinted at the idea that we might actually be around here somewhere if this is a fractal with not 2x room to move up, but something more like 10x. So whenever we are in these expansion phases, it is hard to tell where we're going to end, where we're going to stop. For example, along this whole expansion phase, it was hard to call a top. It really was. I mean, I guess you had some clues like this 1, 2, 3, 4, like quadruple bearish divergence on the daily. Whereas we don't really have that right now because you can't even consider this one because you have lower highs on both charts. So it's not a divergence. Right? So that's the video. I think this looks really bullish. I think this model that we're looking at converges with other models. And this one actually might be one of the more bullish models that we have because it essentially says, you know what? Historically, we've seen the moving average slope up very, very, very quickly, and we haven't seen that recently. And to see that would correspond to something kind of insane, like I just showed you guys, where, we could be looking at much, much higher prices if we're to achieve the same slope, and we could be looking at a similar fractal to over here. We still have 10x to move up 40, 50 cents. I mean, anything's in the cards right now. We're very close to breaking the top of this sort of channel bull flag. So we'll keep you updated. I think the chart looks great. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below. Leave a thumbs up if you enjoy this kind of quantitative, technical, hybrid analysis on the HEX charts. Be subscribed most definitely by now if you aren't already. Let's go ahead and get to 2,300 subscribers. You guys are absolutely crushing it with the views and the subs, so I really do appreciate that. Go ahead and follow me on Twitter. I'll leave a link to that in the description below. As always, check out the website, LookIntoHex.com, and I'll catch you in a future video. Peace.